Welcome back to the Seedy AF podcast. I'm Jocelyn.
And I'm the Omega. It's great to have you joining us for another episode as we dive into the process of character creation and crafting love interest in adult visual novels. Now let's get seedy.
In today's episode, we'll be answering a question from our community member Mibsmeeb on Reddit, who asked, out of all the love interests present in your games, which of them did you spend the most time working on as far as personality, backstory, character design, how many times the character underwent changes, etc.? Mibsmeeb specifically asked about A Shot in the Dark, but I know players will be interested to hear our answers for Prince of Suburbia too.
So for Prince of Suburbia, this is all the way back in 2017 when I originally came up with the ideas for the characters. I would say that the two easiest characters to come up with were Catherine and Sarah. Catherine, she was the stereotypical mom or stepmom type character you would imagine in these kind of scenarios, you know, where she's a little more repressed emotionally and sexually. And this kind of leads to the quote unquote big payoff for these types of games that have the landlady roommate kind of situation going on. And then Sarah, she's the typical tsundere type, which for a lot of these adult visual novels and anime and all that kind of stuff in general, the sister is very much in that kind of situation, and it's very common. So for those, it was much easier coming up with those initially because of that. Like, you know, that's what players expect to see. It's kind of like cookie cutter. It's what they're going to be satisfied if they see and how the story typically unfolds for these. So we didn't really stray away from that for those. And then the other two that required a little bit more thought, Sonia. And for her, you know, just decided to have her be like a down-to-earth woman who loves sex and is completely open about it and has no shame regarding it. And then Fiona is much more the stereotypical, like, good girl, very innocent, naive, wholesome, lovable character.
Yeah, I would say that pretty much sums up what we started with for Prince of Suburbia. And then, as I mentioned in a previous episode, I came in and rewrote Prince of Suburbia from scratch in late 2021 because while I had been involved with writing the first two updates, I hadn't touched it really since then as far as writing, and we'd had various writers throughout the years, and so it was kind of a mishmash. That said, you know, I definitely kept all of those stereotypes or kind of archetypes, you might call them, because as the Omega said, that is what is expected in this genre. And people are looking for the motherly type, the tsundere, the more slutty character, the more naive virgin character. You know, these are all archetypes that are pretty universal that people want. And I know for some people that don't necessarily that maybe like things to be more unpredictable or don't like those archetypes, it can feel really frustrating that most games have them. But this is something that really exists in all entertainment if you pay attention. There are just certain tropes that are really popular, and that's why they pop up over and over again. All that to say that I never had any plans of rewriting the characters in terms of what their archetypes were, but something that was kind of missing from the original story was really strong motivations and for why characters were behaving the way that they were behaving. There were already a lot of plot points in the game that we kept, and I had to keep a lot of the plot points because the art for them was already created. So those things were going to happen no matter what. So for me, I had to kind of work backwards from that and decide, you know, what would cause a character to behave in that way and how can I make this a little bit more cohesive? So you didn't touch on Heather and Naomi that are the neighbors. Their stories didn't really change very drastically from what you had originally. However, they didn't really have reasons for why they were behaving that way. And so that was something that I added in was, even if it's not the most believable or complex reason, characters need a motivation. And, you know, at the end of the day, I recognize I'm not here writing Pulitzer Prize winning, you know, New York Times best-selling writing here. Like, these are adult games. You know, people don't want to necessarily exert a lot of brain power in order to follow the story. So, you know, I certainly always err on the side of being more simple when I'm kind of given a choice to be more complex, you know, because people do want it to feel kind of familiar. It's like comfort food. People want to kind of know what's going to happen because they don't want to feel like they're being jerked all over the place, especially with a game like Prince of Suburbia that's a little bit more lighthearted and pretty much knows what it is and, you know, and is just there to deliver, you know, exactly what it says on the can, essentially. I will say, too, that something that I see kind of, you know, criticism, or not a criticism, but a debate that I see a lot on amongst players when it comes to any game is talking about what's realistic and what's not realistic. And I think that's just a standard to which you cannot hold any entertainment. If entertainment was realistic, it would be boring. Nobody wants to watch real life. That's why even reality shows have a narrative that they edit and that they mold things to in order to fit that narrative. there is no story if you don't have a little bit of suspension of disbelief, because again, otherwise it would just be real life and nobody wants to just read about real life. I think a lot of times what players are talking about when they're talking about realism is really immersion. And so as a writer, you have to create the rules of your world and how the characters behave and what motivates them and all of that. And it doesn't necessarily have to be true to real life, but it has to be true to itself throughout the story. And so that's something I feel like you and I, we've talked in previous episodes about disagreements that we've had, is that, I've come to you sometimes when I kind of need help. I'm like, writer's block, I'm stuck on a thing, and I'm like, okay, the character needs to do this, especially if we already have the art for it in the case of rewriting Prince of Suburbia, but I can't figure out how to get them there based on the character that we've already created. And there was many times that you were like, well, it's a porn game, like it doesn't have to be believable. And I think over time I finally made you realize, like, it's not about it being believable in the sense of like this is real life, but it has to be immersive and be coherent and consistent within the world that we've created. And if you don't do that, you will break immersion. So I think that's what a lot of players are really talking about when they talk about things being unrealistic, is that the story is not behaving and the characters are not behaving in consistent ways, which breaks immersion. So I do think with Prince Suburbia that even though the story is like pure soap opera, over the top, like crazy, the story it's heightened reality. It's totally unbelievable from a realism standpoint, but it's consistent with itself. And so that makes it entertaining and immersive.
Yeah. And, I wholeheartedly agree that the writing and, being consistent across the board is extremely important. And at this point, that's one thing that we've seen through reviews and player feedback, which is, the game kind of gripped them with the story. Like, even if they're not a fan of the big boobas, like the story alone and the characters actually having motivation and real personality is what drew them in and kept them in. Another thing I'll say about the original character creation is I initially stumbled upon Scarlet Ann's art. For anybody who doesn't know, that's how this game originally came to be. As far as the art design goes, is I found Scarlet Ann's art in a game called The Zombie's Life. Being a big Booba fan lover, like that's what I saw, and I was like, I definitely want that in my game. And then it just so happened to be that she ended up finishing in development on A Zombie's Life around the time frame that I wanted to try to put my hand in the market here. I talked to her and originally convinced her to come on and start designing these characters. And, being a big Booba fan lover, and one of my mistakes is I let her go hog wild, and I was like, hey, here's their personalities. Can you make these characters that would fit this? It's not her fault. The buck stops with me as far as maybe Catherine should have had like the biggest boobs in the game. And then some of the other characters should have had like maybe a little bit smaller size, but big boobs still. That would have added to more diversity in the game. And some of that stuff also includes like pubic hair. That's another criticism we get. It's a small detail, but it's a detail nonetheless, where players and fans would have liked to see some variation. In the end, without having that in there, it ends up having a lot of the female characters in the game be a little too close or a little too similar to each other. And then the last thing that I'll say is, and a lot of players and fans know this in the adult visual novel market, adult game market, is that redheads seem to be very popular. So that's another one of the reasons why Sarah in the game has red hair too.
As far as the character creation for A Shot in the Dark, I would say that we started off with about 4 or 5 main core characters, and I won't say what they are because I think that would spoil things, but the ones that are essentially essential to making the story happen. And then we added another, 4 or 5 on top of that some of them were originally intended to be kind of more side characters. But at the end of the day, we now have 10 main love interests that will have multiple scenes. So I don't know what criteria people use to decide whether somebody's a main girl or a side girl, but we will have 10 love interests with multiple scenes. And again, I stuck with a lot of the classic tropes that I know players are going to expect from the characters. We have a tsundere, yandere, kudere. These are the, visual novel, Japanese anime tropes that lots of people come to expect. In more maybe Western terms, you're going to have the girl next door, the virgin, the slutty party girl, the ice queen. Again, I just leaned into those tropes that are very universal. Again, I use that term tropes in a very positive sense because I think that things like tropes, they create a guardrail and they might give you like a formula, but within that guardrail or formula, there are really infinite possibilities, right? So I don't see tropes as necessarily being cookie cutter or boring because I think it's your job as a writer to provide the player with something that is familiar in the sense of they immediately recognize, okay, this is the tsundere, but what makes her a tsundere? Why is she like that? How specifically is she like that? And what's going to ultimately make her warm up to the MC? The possibilities there are really infinite. And so that's your job as a writer, is to fill in those blanks, but still give the player a framework that they understand, so that it feels, like I said, like comfort food. And something that's important to me when I knew that I was going to be writing multiple love interests is to have a mix of slow burns, but not only sexual slow burns, but also emotional slow burns. So some characters are going to be very quick to warm up to the MC emotionally, but maybe less quick to progress sexually, vice versa. A tsundere is probably the kind of character that's going to be a slow burn in both senses, right? It's going to take a long time for them to warm up to the MC, both emotionally and to allow things to progress sexually. So I like to have, a mix of those types of things so that every character is kind of on their own arc. And one of the most popular sayings in writing, of course, is to write what you know. I don't know what that means for other writers, but for me, I can never really base characters or stories on myself or specific people that I know or specific things that I've experienced. I can only ever just kind of sprinkle in little tiny things across the entire story that are things that I've either personally experienced or that, people have told me or that I know friends and family have experienced. So I can't point to any character in anything that I've ever written and say, oh, that's me, or oh, that's the Omega, or anything like that. But I do draw on lots of personal life experiences because, storytelling is all in the specifics. The more specific a story is, the better the story is and the stronger the story is. So as far as A Shot in the Dark, the main character, I really based his college experiences on the things that I know from the Omega, other male friend and family members, and also my own experience in college, the things that I witnessed or that male friends told me. He has a lot of things that happened to him that are things I know actually happened to people, but he is not, any particular one person. And, when it comes to the love interest, because they are women and I am women, they end up individually with a lot of, things that are traits that I have, not because I identify with those characters more than another character, but just because, again, a character that has really specific interests and backstory is going to be more interesting. So it's easy to draw specifics from my own life or from the people directly around me. So for example, Ellie's love of the Beatles, that comes from me. I'm obsessed with the Beatles. Alexis, her really blunt and honest nature and how that sometimes gets her in trouble with other people. That's something that, is from my own experience. Natalie's love of romance novels, that comes from me. And Sophie's party girl persona, a lot of her experiences are things that are from my personal experience because I was a big party girl. And so it draws on my personal experience and people that I know. I have to say, now that I'm getting to the age that I'm closer to the MILFs in the story than the younger love interests. Ashley, for example, she's a MILF character. She's afraid of getting old and irrelevant. And I think that anybody over the age of 30 can relate to that. So, I get to know the characters better as I write them and I fill in those more specific details. But I do have a template that I fill out for every character where I decide on all of their internal motivations, external motivations, their internal and external conflicts, the obstacles that are going to stand in the way of them achieving their goals, and what their overall arc or epiphany or whatever is going to be. And sometimes I also decide in a general sense what their wound is sometimes what writers call it. Essentially, what is that thing in their backstory that really explains who they are? So I usually know those kind of macro things ahead of time, and then I fill in the details as I go.
We're definitely getting older, but you already know my taste. And one thing I'll say is, I definitely think that you should embrace the MILF stereotype because that's where we are, and I love it, and I hope you love it too. Anyways,
I think my experience of it is that MILFs get a lot of love in the entertainment world, but the real life experience of being a woman of that age is that you're definitely a lot more invisible than you used to be when you were younger.
Yeah, I won't pretend to understand what that feels like. All I can say is that I love the way that you look, so that's what matters to me.
Well, you do love MILFs. So.
Yeah. Yep. For some random notes about the character creation for A Shot in the Dark, one part where I probably pushed a little too much, a little too hard, and we've talked about this a little bit in previous episodes, are the big boobas, right? We probably have too many female characters with big boobas where we could have had a little more diversity on that side of things. There's still characters, of course, that aren't as big as some of the bigger boobs in the game, but we could have done a better job on that end. And I take full credit and blame for pushing on that end. One thing that was fun is, including the racial diversity in the game. Hopefully that ends up being a female character to romance for everybody. Granted, it is 10 characters. There's a chance it may not end up working out and the personality types may not mesh, but at the very least, we tried to do our best on that end. Another note that people may not know is that Ashley is actually based off of Christina Hendricks. Now, I don't remember if you went that direction on your own or if I mentioned it or how that went.
I always knew that you loved Christina Hendricks, so I don't remember that you specifically asked for that, but I think it was just always a given that the main MILF character was going to be based on Christina Hendricks.
So when I saw what Ashley looked like in the game, and when I figured out that she was based off Christina Hendricks, she instantly became my favorite character, regardless of personality, just because of that. And then also, I wanted to give Jocelyn credit on Alexis. My humble opinion is that Alexis is one of the best looking Black female characters that is out in the adult visual novel universe right now. Another interesting one to me was Paloma, and this is kind of harkens back to my military days. The reason being is that Paloma is so dominant, but she's so short. When I went through some training, we had a senior drill sergeant who all the other drill sergeants in my company were afraid of. And they would always tell the soldiers, the privates, the specialists, etc., do not piss off senior private. All right. If you piss off senior, everyone's going to get it. And yeah, she was very scary. She was short, but my goodness, did she have booming lungs because everyone heard her on the entire base, basically, it felt like, whenever she was mad at somebody.
In a physical sense, it was definitely important to me that we have a wide variety of characters in the sense of body types and ethnicity, so not just different types of personalities, but different types of visuals as well. One thing that we get asked quite often is people ask us if we can tell them which DAZ models we used as the basis for our characters. I'm assuming so that they can make fan art. The unfortunate thing for them is that I used almost no base characters from the DAZ store. I used the skins of characters from the DAZ store, which sounds really gross, but that's how it works, is that you can use the skin material from any model on any DAZ figure. So I did hunt for what I felt like were the best skin materials with the most detail. However, I started with the base DAZ female model, and then I modified it from there with morphs and sliders until I achieved the look that I wanted. I did not really use any of the base models from the DAZ store as a starting point. And so one of the first things I did after I kind of decided on all of the characters and what their personalities and backstories and motivations and conflicts were going to be was that I collected images of real life people to be references for what they looked like. This is a process that I do when I'm writing novels as well, because I need to be able to describe the characters. So for me, that was the logical next step, was to collect some visuals of what they looked like in my mind. Some of those were famous people. Some of them were just random images that I found on Google Images, but I did use real life references for every character. So I think that's one of the reasons why we get a lot of compliments on the diversity of the characters, the fact that they all have different faces. We do have a lot of different ethnicities and skin colors. And so all of that is, I put a lot of work. I spent probably an entire month designing the love interests. Ashley was the first one who was created, and she was based on Christina Hendricks. Like I said, I don't remember if that was something that you asked for or I just knew was like what it should be.
Either way, it worked out really well.
Yeah. We obviously knew too that we wanted to have some curvier love interests. Right now, obviously, big booty is all the rage. I think it's funny. We see a lot of players complaining about the lack of small boobs in games, but I almost never see anybody complaining about the lack of flat butts. So I think that, having a big round booty is a pretty popular choice. It's not very polarizing. That said, I did make sure that we had some characters with smaller booties, or the Omega calls them more Midwestern booties. But you can't really go wrong with a big booty. So we definitely have some big booties, and we never get complaints on that. We also knew we wanted to have redheads. Those are so popular. Freckles are really popular. When it came to creating Alexis, that was definitely something that I had not seen in my market research up to that point. And again, when I was doing it, it was early 2021. So obviously a lot more games have come on the market since then. So I'm not speaking for, any game past 2021. And obviously I didn't play every single game out there, even at that point. But I struggled to find a really realistic looking Black woman in any of these games. And so I did make it one of my goals, was to have a character that was a really realistic and beautiful Black woman. And so I think Ashley, because she was the first character I designed, and then Alexis, because because I cared the most about making sure that she was really authentic and beautiful. Those are the two characters that I spent the most time on. So I don't think it's a coincidence that they're the two most popular characters as far as receiving compliments on their looks. And I know that Alexis in particular brings a lot of players to the game. And also, I also agree that making Paloma short but dominating was an intentional choice because I just love that dynamic. And it was also a very safe character to make short because there was no risk of her being seen as underage because she's, in her 30s. So there was no risk of it seeming like we were trying to make a shorter or more petite character in order to, push some boundary with age limits, because she's very clearly, although she's not a mother, she's more of the MILF, age.
And then for the last part here, we're going to go over just a little bit of the lessons learned about creating love interest for future games.
Some of the lessons that we've learned, I think we've talked about quite a bit already, but is just to provide even more variety when it comes to body types and skin tones, races, ethnicities. So I think something that we've learned is that when you're making the art pre-rendered, like you do when you have hand-drawn 2D art or when you're making pre-rendered images in DAZ, is that in order to have a really wide variety of things, you have to have a lot of characters, and that can get really complicated. So something that we're looking for in the future, whether it be our next game or a game after that, is a game that is not pre-rendered, but is rendered on the player's computer, which would allow for a lot more player customization and would allow for a lot more diversity of characters without having to have like a million different characters. So that concludes our episode. We hope you enjoyed this behind-the-scenes look at how we craft the love interests in our games.
As always, if you have more questions or topics you'd like us to explore, please don't hesitate to reach out. We're excited to continue sharing our experiences with you. We hope we planted some seeds with you. See you next time.
Bye.